Before the sky remembers the sun, and before the waves fully wake, a single canoe cuts through the darkness, silent but alive. Its movement is almost too quiet to notice, yet the sea responds as if it recognizes something ancient. Who rose before dawn, when even the stars seem unsure of their place? And why does the ocean listen more closely when no one is watching? This is a journey measured not in distance, but in stillness, intuition, and the hushed knowledge passed down without words. Lean in. There's something in the quiet that you're meant to hear. Before we begin, let your body become quiet. Let your eyes drift closed or soften their gaze. You're surrounded by soft night air, damp with salt, not quite cool, not quite warm, just still. You imagine you're not where you are, but on a wooden canoe in the dark hours before sunrise, somewhere in the scattered coral atolls of the South Pacific. There are no lights around you, just the hush of the ocean, the creaking of the outrigger frame, and the distant sound of seabirds waking far before dawn. You're not moving quickly. You're not lost. You're just being carried. Out here, in this quiet sea, the world moved not by hours or clocks, but by wind and wave and memory. And tonight, you're going to listen to how they once did it. How long ago, Polynesian navigators crossed this vast ocean. Not with compasses, but with the feel of the water, the scent of rain, and the tilt of stars above them. We begin now on one such journey. They set out in the final hours of night, when the stars were still bright, but the winds had changed. A canoe carved from breadfruit wood, its edges lashed with senet cord, curved out from a sheltered lagoon on Ana Atoll. There were 5 men and 2 boys on board, and none of them spoke as the paddles dipped silently into the still water. To speak during the departure would be a waste of breath. These were the hours of memory, of recitation in the mind. Words would come later. Their destination lay to the west, to Fakarava, across nearly 60 nautical miles of open ocean. But that wasn't how they measured it. Not in miles, not in distance. The direction was carried in the bones. Te Aho o Te Rangi, the thread of the sky. They would follow a known star path, adjust for swell, shift for current, and keep one eye always on the color of the water beneath them. But first, they had to get past the reef. The channel was narrow, and only the navigator, an older man named Tavi, held the steering paddle. His feet were planted in the wet fibers of the hull, his eyes fixed on nothing. He did not look at the stars yet. He listened to the hiss of water against coral, to the way the canoe's bow lifted slightly too early. That meant there was a shift. He turned the paddle without thinking. Once out into open sea, Tavi finally looked up. Above him, the western horizon was low and dark, while the east glowed faintly blue. That was good. It gave contrast to the sky, allowed the stars to pop. He scanned the dome for the star he needed, Pirae, one of the white-silver stars that traveled low on the horizon. When it passed through the notch in the canoe's bow, he would know they were lined up. It wasn't there yet. They would paddle by the shape of the waves for now. The boys sat near the middle, quiet and observant. This was their first overnight journey. They had learned the chants, had traced patterns in sand, had watched the elders move their fingers over shell maps strung with cord. But now, in the dark and with no land behind or ahead, they were adrift in more than just the ocean. Their senses were flooded, too much blackness, too much salt. It was almost dizzying. To calm themselves, they watched the old man. Tavi moved very little. He was like part of the boat. Sometimes he dipped his fingers into the sea. Sometimes he tasted the wind. And always, he watched the water. What he was looking for wasn't visible to them. He sought signs in the wave pattern, the alignment of swells generated by distant storms. These swells radiated across thousands of miles, and a skilled navigator could detect 2 or 3 crossing systems. Tavi felt the canoe rocking gently in one direction, then being nudged from another. That was expected. But the third pulse, faint and short, came from the south. That was wrong. He kept it to himself. For now, they could correct later, but he needed to confirm. Reaching behind him, he pulled a damp coconut husk from the lashing and tossed it into the sea. It floated briefly before the canoe pulled ahead. The boys stared. It looked meaningless. But moments later, Tavi nodded. The husk had drifted off to the left. That meant the surface current was dragging southward more strongly than usual. "Uafetia matai," he murmured, not loudly. The wind was blinking. This was the kind of expression that didn't translate easily. It meant that the usual pattern had shifted in a way the sky didn't yet show. A skilled voyager had to believe the water before the sky, and the body before the mind. They adjusted course slightly, no big turn, no dramatic sweep, just a few degrees shift to starboard. The boys saw nothing change, but they were now tracing a different line, one that threaded between unseen forces. By the time the stars faded and dawn began to silver the east, they had been at sea for several hours. The wind rose faintly. It had the warm scent of rain in it, even though no clouds were yet visible. Tavi inhaled slowly. He knew that smell. It came from freshwater runoff, and if the scent was strong at sea, it meant there was a nearby island where rainfall had recently flowed into the lagoon. He pointed wordlessly toward a bank of low, rising clouds on the western edge of the sky. They were too far off to see shape, but their color and movement suggested land. "Smell it," he said to one of the boys. The boy closed his eyes and sniffed. "It smells like plants," he said, uncertain. "No," Tavi replied. "It smells like heat on wet stone." He wasn't being poetic. This was how they taught. The air over land, especially after rain, carried minerals and aromas from volcanic rock, even coral. These smells traveled on air currents, sometimes stronger than visible signs. It was one of the many senses most travelers ignored. But in Polynesia, it was part of the map. The sea remained calm. Small flying fish skimmed the surface. The boys tried to keep themselves still. Any motion disrupted the feel of the canoe's response. They were being trained in how to feel the hull bend, not as wood, but as a translator of wave language. A canoe was not just transport, it was sensor. They ate nothing yet. They drank only a mouthful of water from gourds. Tavi said little. At midday, when the sun was highest, he would take a reading using no tools. Just the angle of the sun on the inside of his arm, but that would come later. Now they moved quietly, guided by what could not be seen. A smell of unseen rain, a third pulse in the wave, and a memory that refused to fade. And still the question hung in the boys' minds, unspoken but heavy. How could a direction exist when there was nothing to see? The question lingered in the minds of the boys, even as the canoe continued westward. How could direction exist without something to see? The ocean offered no trail behind, and ahead was only a low blue blur on the horizon that might not be real. The answer wouldn't come in words. It came in noticing what the older men did not question. They did not search for the horizon. They paid no mind to the invisible destination. They adjusted course as if guided by something they could feel under their ribs. Mid-morning came quietly. The heat grew heavier, and the wind dropped again. The clouds that Tavi had pointed toward now rose more sharply, standing like teeth against the sky. The younger of the two boys whispered to himself, counting seconds between the lapping waves. It was not something taught. He had invented it to keep calm, to convince himself time was still passing. Tavi finally gestured for a gourd of water. Each person took a sip, just enough to wet the mouth. No food yet. The canoe was still traveling on stored rhythm, the deep push of swells coming from the far southeast. This rhythm was more reliable than stars in daylight. Tavi traced it with his foot, bare toes gently tapping the inner curve of the hull. He was not counting, not exactly. He was sensing interruption. Near noon, a change arrived. It was not loud, just a shift in air weight, the way the bow pulled slightly to port. It meant cross-current, likely from a submerged reef far below the surface. Such things didn't appear on maps, but the body of the canoe felt them. Tavi called to the boy seated nearest him. "What do you feel under your heel?" The boy slid his bare foot forward. "A lean to the left," he said quietly. "Not left," Tavi said. "Down and back." The boy nodded slowly. He could feel it now. The canoe was being drawn, not pushed. The water was lifting slightly behind and beneath. "That's the edge of something," Tavi added. "We're brushing the side of a deep channel. Feel the pull." The boy nodded again. The other adult said nothing. This was how the learning happened, through invitation, not command. There were no long lectures, no diagrams now. This was training by silence, by attention. The boy had learned more in the last 6 hours than in months of shore practice. Above them, the sky turned pale and flat. No shadows fell on the canoe. The clouds overhead were thin, but not colorless. They held faint yellow and gray at their roots. This was what Tavi had expected. He reached into a leaf-wrapped bundle and removed a string of seed pods. Without explanation, he dropped them into the water off the bow. They floated, moving quickly backward along the canoe's flank, then away at an angle. He watched carefully. "They're cutting too fast," he muttered. One of the other men, named Rua, leaned forward. "We're nearing the shoulder. Want to correct?" "Not yet. Let the current finish. We'll hold on." The boys remained still. They knew better than to ask, but their ears listened as hard as their eyes watched. Every word carried weight. The language of navigation was never wasted. By early afternoon, a haze formed on the horizon. Not heavy clouds, not storms, just a shimmer. It could mean heat rising off distant land, or it could be an illusion. Tavi didn't trust it yet. Instead, he tested the scent again. He dipped a palm in the water, raised it wet to his nose, and inhaled. Not the salt, he was smelling past that, for something faint and sharp. "Shell rot," he said to himself. That was a useful sign. In lagoons where shellfish colonies collected near outflows, the decay left a trace smell, barely perceptible but unique. It meant a nearby island had deep water passes, and it meant they were nearing outer reefs. The wind rose briefly, enough to rustle the palm matting tied to the center mast. It wasn't enough to sail, but enough to feel a difference. Tavi's eyes remained focused on the direction from which the gust came. If it carried scent again, sweetness or soil, he would change heading. But the smell was blank, just open sea. Then came the birds, two circling low, then diving, then rising again. Not fast birds, not wide gliders. These were noddies, smaller darting seabirds known for staying close to reefs and atolls. Their presence in open sea was significant. "Watch them," Tavi said softly. "They're not fishing." The boys turned their gaze upward. The birds were not diving for food. They were looping in loose patterns, as if circling something not visible. This was what Tavi had waited for. He shifted the steering paddle with one clean movement. The canoe gently altered course by 10 degrees. The noddies altered with it, keeping ahead and slightly above. Tavi's face relaxed. They were not guessing now. Still, no land was visible. The sea remained flat, with only the occasional cross-chop breaking the pattern. The sun lowered, softening the glare. Shadows returned slowly, lengthening across the canoe's floor. Tavi finally nodded toward the food bundle. It was time. Dried taro, wrapped in woven pandanus leaf, was passed out in strips, a few bites only. Eating was not for fullness, it was for timing. It marked the midpoint of the day's journey. As they chewed quietly, Tavi told a brief tale. Not loudly, not for entertainment. It was a memory. "When I was your age," he began, "my grandfather told me about a voyage to Hikweru. They left at sunset, followed a double swell, but made no landfall for 2 days. They had passed it, gone wide. He said he smelled iron in the air. That's how they turned back." The boys waited. "Smelled iron?" one finally asked. "Some islands have rock near the beach. If the rain is recent and the sun is right, the smell carries." The boys absorbed this silently. In the distance, the birds began to dip lower. Then, suddenly, one peeled off and flew sharply west, away from the canoe's path. Tavi watched it, then smiled faintly. "Now," he said. He shifted the paddle again, only slightly. This was a narrow cue. The bird's movement had signaled an outer reef shelf. The time to align their approach was short. If they waited too long, the swell would push them too far north. The rest of the afternoon was a steady arc, subtle, deliberate. The canoe glided more than moved, and the wind remained barely present. Occasionally, Tavi instructed the boys to touch the water, to note the warmth. "You feel that?" he asked. They nodded. "Where it turns cool, we're entering shadow." Not literal shadow, shadow in current. A term for when the water changed layers, often near underwater ridges. They passed into cooler water. The sea color shifted, not dramatically, but enough to hint at shallows beyond. Still no land in sight. Then came the rain scent again, this time unmistakable. It rode low on the breeze and it carried both salt and wet bark. Tavi inhaled deeply. "Northwest reef, close." He pointed. Nothing visible, but he knew. The canoe's pace remained even. They did not rush. To reach too quickly risked missing the pass. It was late afternoon when the first line of coral became visible, a faint shadow beneath the water, then a soft spray of foam as a wave broke over it. The reef. They had arrived. No cheers, no excitement, just quiet recognition. Tavi adjusted the steering paddle, angling them toward the known pass, marked by the way the swells broke unevenly to one side. As they entered the pass, the water calmed instantly, the lagoon welcoming them with glassy stillness. The boys exhaled, realizing how tense they had been. They had seen no compass, no chart, no clock, only smells, birds, shadows, and motion. As the canoe slid into the lagoon, the shoreline of Fakarava rose gently ahead, palm trees silhouetted in gold light, and the faint smoke of evening cooking fires rising straight into the air. They had crossed nearly 60 nautical miles using no instruments, no maps, and yet they had never been lost. But as the sun dipped and stars prepared to return, one of the boys looked at Tavi and finally asked what had been unspoken all day. "What happens when all the signs disappear?" Tavi paused, his eyes turning back toward the sea they had just crossed. "The sea never forgets," he said quietly. "But we do." The evening firelight along the shoreline barely flickered as the canoe glided into the lagoon. The arrival was not ceremonial. No crowd met them. The men on shore had seen the birds circling earlier, had noticed the slight thickening of sea haze, had already guessed a canoe was on its way. In these islands, arrival was expected. That too was part of navigation, an understanding that journeys didn't end. They folded back into the rhythm of daily life. Tavi stepped off the canoe into the shallows and paused to feel the sand. Not with reverence, but with memory. The grain here was finer than on Ana. The current brought it differently, deposited it more gradually. It told him that the reef pass had not shifted since his last visit. That was good. Even a slight change in underwater slope could mean a new pattern of approach on the next crossing. The boys followed slowly, eyes adjusting to the closeness of land after so many hours of open water. Fakarava was not unfamiliar. They had heard stories, had seen traders return from here, but it felt denser than their home island. The palms seemed taller, the sounds more muffled. It was the hush of an island used to watching, not speaking. They would stay only one night. The return journey would begin before the second sunrise. Tavi had reasons, he always did, but he didn't explain. Instead, after settling in a small guest shelter, he asked the boys to walk with him, not to explore, not to greet, just to walk. They followed the shoreline for a long time without speaking. The air was filled with the sharp, sweet smell of drying pandanus and the faint trace of fish brine. Fires crackled behind palm fences, and dogs barked once or twice but quickly fell silent. Every sound seemed absorbed by the thick thatch of the island. Finally, they reached a small rise, just high enough to see the curve of the lagoon. Tavi stopped. "This is where I stood 30 years ago," he said, gesturing to a line of volcanic stones half buried in the soil. "We had sailed from Hao. We were off by half a night. We missed the reef and waited in open sea until light returned." He tapped his foot gently against one of the stones. "I watched the clouds that night. They were wrong. The wind was wrong. But the sea stayed steady. We trusted it." The boys waited. "One of the elders on that voyage," he continued, "he told me that you only get lost when you stop believing the sea is speaking to you." Tavi turned, facing back toward the water. "That's the part that's hard to teach, how to listen when the sea isn't speaking loudly." They walked back slowly, the boys absorbing every word. Not because the story was dramatic, it wasn't. There was no storm, no rescue, but the subtlety of the lesson sat heavy. The idea that silence itself could be a message, that waiting was not failure, that knowing when not to move was a skill of equal value. Back at the shelter, an elder named Mareka joined them. He had lived on Fakarava his entire life and knew Tavi from earlier crossings. They shared a meal, steamed breadfruit, grilled reef fish, and coconut water. It was quiet but not solemn. After the meal, Mareka brought out a folded bundle, a cloth map not made for voyaging, but for remembering. It had colored threads stitched into it, each one indicating a star path or a current line. He spread it between them in the lantern glow and pointed to a thread dyed in deep red. "This is the path you took today," he said. "It bends too far south now. The currents have shifted again." Tavi nodded slowly. "I felt it," he replied. "South pole just before midday. We corrected before the Nadis turned." Mareka smiled. "You still catch their language." The boys leaned in, looking closely at the stitched lines. They knew maps like these weren't for planning. They were for comparing memory with movement, a way to see if what was felt had been real. A confirmation. Mareka pointed to another thread, almost invisible, stitched in soft blue. "This one," he said, "goes past Aratika. It's been lost. No one's used it in over a decade." Tavi studied it for a moment. "Too many small shifts," he said. "That path was never stable." Mareka nodded. Still, it was a good one. When it held, it was fast. They talked late into the night about routes that had vanished, not because the sea had erased them, but because people had stopped using them. Without use, the knowledge dimmed. Without repetition, memory faded. The boys listened in silence. It was clear they were not just witnessing a conversation. They were being invited to inherit something, the burden of remembering, not as an honor, but as a necessity. Sleep came slowly, wrapped in humidity and the low hum of insects. The lagoon barely stirred outside, and the stars had returned in full force, casting pale reflections on the water's skin. The boys dreamt restlessly, their minds still crossing water even in rest. Before dawn, they rose again. Tavi had already prepared the canoe, tightening the lashings and rebalancing the load. There was no urgency in his movement, only precision. The return trip would be slightly longer, adjusted for countercurrent and the position of Ararua in the northwest. They would tack wide, swing north, and then curve back southeast toward Ana. It was a loop, not a line. Before departure, Mareka handed Tavi a small carved shell, a memory token. "Keep this," he said. "It came from a reef no longer above water." Tavi accepted it with quiet thanks. The canoe left Fakarava in darkness once more. This time, the boys noticed more. They felt the current before the bow shifted. They tracked the stars with their eyes instead of waiting to be told. They watched the birds, not with wonder, but with calculation. This was how learning became knowing, not from instruction, but from attention. A few hours into the journey, the sky grew heavy. A band of rain cloud formed low along the northeast, blotting out several of the star markers. It was not a storm, just obscuration, a test. Tavi didn't speak. He let the boys react. The older one glanced down at the water, then out across the waves. "We're losing the star path," he said quietly. The younger one nodded, fingers brushing the edge of the canoe. But the wave feels steady. Tavi turned the steering paddle gently. Keep tracking the wave. The stars will return. And they did. Not all at once, but in pieces. One by one, the brightest reappeared, their alignment still sound. The boys learned something then. That navigation was not dependent on any one marker. It was redundancy. Layers of knowing. If one disappeared, another would take its place. By midday, they passed the first float marker dropped on the outward journey. It was still drifting, now caught in a looped eddy that held it in slow spiral. Tavi plucked it from the sea and smiled faintly. It remembered us, he said. The wind rose slowly in the afternoon, enough to stretch the small sail. They unfurled it, letting the canoe ease forward without paddling. The boys sat with their backs to the mast, faces up to the wind. It smelled of home now, familiar brine, the faint trace of shellfish, and that odd dryness that only their own lagoon carried. As the sun descended, a na appeared as a blur. First, just a smudge on the edge of water and sky, then a definite shape, then a recognizable shore. The reef pass was familiar, but not automatic. They still approached slowly, noting the wave breaks, the color shifts, the bird calls. Confirmation, not assumption. They entered just as the tide began to pull in. Easy entry. On shore, no one greeted them. Not out of indifference, but out of custom. A voyage was private until retold. Only when the stories were shared did the crossing truly end. That evening, around the fire, the boys finally spoke. Not of the arrival, but of the shifts. The moments they had noticed, the smells they had caught, the patterns they had anticipated. Tavi listened without comment. Only when they had finished did he speak. You saw what you needed to see. You felt what was there. Now remember. He did not say more. The sea would always be there. The stars would rise and fall. The winds would speak in their own time. But memory, if not used, would sink faster than stone. The next morning began before the stars had fully faded. In the darkness, the village on Ana moved slowly. No urgency, only the rhythm of a place where time bent itself around the sun, the tide, and the weather. The boys woke before anyone had called for them. Their sleep had been restless, interrupted not by dreams, but by a kind of persistent echo. Waves that no longer rocked them but still lingered in their muscles. The canoe had returned, but some part of their attention remained offshore. Tavi was already walking along the lagoon's edge. He wasn't inspecting anything in particular. His hands were behind his back. His bare feet left faint impressions in the wet sand, only to be erased seconds later by the licking edge of the tide. He moved like someone who had done this for years, not out of habit, but because such mornings invited a certain silence. And in silence, patterns rose. He wasn't thinking about the next voyage yet. The next crossing was a thought for another day. But that didn't mean he wasn't observing. A piece of driftwood caught his eye, a familiar kind, from a tree not native to Ana. He paused, knelt, and turned it over. Beneath, small barnacles had begun to cluster. That told him it had not been floating for long. It came from the east, likely Nengo, perhaps even beyond. He tossed it gently back into the water, not out of indifference, but as a sign that it had arrived, and so its journey was complete. Behind him, the village began to stir. Children's voices broke the morning hush. Smoke rose from low cooking fires. Tavi didn't turn. The day was not yet ready to be met directly. He watched the clouds instead, low, moving slightly faster than yesterday. That told him the upper air was shifting. The weather would turn, not today, but soon. Later, near mid-morning, the boys joined him. They didn't speak at first. Tavi nodded to them once, then gestured toward a nearby canoe hull laid out for repair. "You'll help with the bindings today," he said simply. They followed. There was no fanfare. The voyage was over, but its memory still had to be tied into something. That was what work was for. Not just labor, but storage. Every act repeated anchored the past into the present. Lash the hull, remember the swell, tie the cord, recall the scent. The canoe frame was old. Its underside was smooth from years of sanding. The boys ran their fingers along the wood and felt slight dips where water had worn channels over time. Each groove was a story, unreadable to most, but not to those who had traveled enough. Tavi handed them lengths of senet cord. It was coarse and stiff, made from coconut husk fibers that had been soaked, dried, and twisted. The process of making it took weeks. The binding of it would take hours. Neither was rushed. "Start with the center beam," he said, "not too tight." They began. The cord creaked as it pulled through the hull's grooves. The knots were simple, loops and figure eights, but the pattern mattered. The binding had to breathe with the hull, not fight it. A tight canoe was a fast canoe, but too tight, and it would crack under stress. As they worked, Tavi stepped away, watching from a distance. Not just watching the knots, but the rhythm. Were they pausing at the right places? Were their fingers remembering without overthinking? The real test of a voyager wasn't the paddle stroke. It was how one worked when no one was looking. He returned after some time and squatted beside them. "Do you know why we use cord and not nails?" he asked. The older boy answered first. "Because nails split the wood." Tavi nodded. "Yes, but also because nails are final. Cord can be changed." He pointed at their hands. "That's what your journey gave you. Not just direction, but change." The boys didn't reply, but the idea settled between them like weight. Work continued until noon. The sun bore down hard now, and the village slowed in response. Even the dogs lay still in the shade. Tavi called for a break and handed the boys coconut halves filled with cool water. They drank slowly, and Tavi began to speak. Not instruction, but story. "There was once a navigator from Raroya," he said. "He was known not for speed, but for certainty. Others would reach first, but he never missed." The boys listened. One season, he took a new apprentice, very proud, very skilled. The boy had memorized the stars, knew the winds, could name every current. But on their first voyage, they were caught in a patternless sky, cloud cover for 3 nights. He paused. "What did the apprentice do?" the younger boy asked. "He panicked," Tavi said. "He looked for signs that weren't there. He invented meaning where there was only noise." The older boy frowned. "And the navigator?" Tavi smiled slightly. He waited. There was quiet for a moment. On the 4th day, the clouds parted. They were only 2 miles off course. The boys absorbed this. The message was clear, but Tavi added one more line. "Your mind is loud, the sea is not. Wait for the sea to speak." Later that afternoon, Tavi brought them to a gathering hut, where a group of older voyagers sat weaving and carving. They were not instructors, not formal elders, just men who had traveled enough to be left alone unless spoken to. Tavi led the boys to them and introduced them simply. They crossed to Fakarava. They tracked noddies and smelled reef before landfall. The men nodded. One of them, bent nearly double with age, tapped the floor beside him. "Sit then," he said. "Your ears still work." And so they sat, and they listened. The stories told were not linear. They jumped between voyages, between mistakes and clever recoveries, between years and islands. One man described finding an atoll by noticing the way lightning refracted in the clouds. Another spoke of timing a journey by the way breadfruit trees dropped their fruit prematurely in certain seasons. None of it was taught in order. That wasn't the point. The point was to fill the air with memory and to let the listener sort it in time. By evening, the boys were silent again, not from fatigue, but from fullness. Their minds had taken in more than they could yet name. Tavi walked them back along the lagoon. "Tomorrow," he said, "you'll learn to sleep at sea." The boys looked at him, puzzled. "We already did," the older one said. Tavi shook his head. "No, you waited at sea, you endured, but you didn't sleep." He looked out over the water. A real voyager can rest even when there is no land. Sleep is not surrender, it's trust. That night, they slept on woven mats near the canoe shed. The stars stretched out above them, and the water lapped softly not far off. But the younger boy remained awake, staring into the blackness above. He was still holding something from the journey, something unsettled. Finally, he turned and whispered, "What happens when no one remembers the routes anymore?" Tavi, who was awake too, replied without opening his eyes, "Then the sea still holds them, waiting." The boy was quiet. "But how do we find them again?" he asked. Tavi took a breath, long and even. "By listening longer than we think we should." They woke before the light came. The air was still, cool for once, the kind of stillness that arrives before a weather shift. It was not yet humid, not yet dry, balanced in a kind of silence that made every small sound feel larger than it was. One of the boys sat up and looked toward the lagoon. He couldn't see the canoe, but he knew it was still there, tethered at the edge of the water. His body remembered the curve of its hull, the motion of its joints. He stretched his hands without thinking, as if to hold a paddle that wasn't there. Tavi appeared without sound, his footsteps swallowed by the sand. He carried nothing but a small woven mat and a bundle of cured leaves. "Come," he said. "We won't go far today." The boys followed. They didn't question it. They walked down the lagoon shore, then up along a ridge path that curved just beyond the village. This path didn't lead anywhere special, just a rise where the wind caught more clearly. It had once been used to dry fishing nets, but now it was mostly overgrown. They stopped near a cluster of low shrubs and sat. Tavi placed the bundle between them and began to unwrap it. Inside were dried strips of leaf, some braided, others tied in loops. "These are for memory," he said. "Not the kind you speak, the kind your hands know." The boys looked at the loops. They didn't recognize their purpose. He handed one to each of them. "Tie one every time you remember something the sea taught you," he said. "No need to say it aloud." They examined the loops. One had a knot that shifted when pulled, the other twisted into itself like a shell. "They're not charms," he added. "They don't guide you. They remind you that you've been guided before." They worked quietly, threading the dried leaf between fingers, imitating the fold they had been shown. The air moved softly around them, bringing the scent of warm rock and the faint sweetness of dried fruit fermenting somewhere below the ridge. After a time, Tavi stood. "We won't go out today," he said. "We'll stay near the reef. It's time you listen to the water standing still." It was not a metaphor. That afternoon, they walked to a shallow tidal flat at the eastern edge of the atoll, where the water barely moved. It was ankle deep, filled with small fish, the occasional shell crab, and wide stretches of flat coral tile that glinted in the sun. This was not a place for launching canoes or catching fish. This was where patterns revealed themselves slowly. Tavi crouched in the shallows and placed a shell upside down in the water. It didn't move. He waited, then pressed one edge gently. A bubble rose from beneath. "The reef breathes," he said. "Not like we do, but enough." The boys watched. A second bubble rose, this one farther away. "When it breathes in," he continued, "the tide draws back. When it breathes out, it pushes forward, but it's not just about tide." He lifted the shell again and placed it farther along the flat. This time it tilted immediately. "That slope," he said, "tells you where the reef ends, where it falls away." One of the boys bent and tried it himself. He found a spot where the shell rocked slowly, not quite stable. Tavi nodded. "That's a ledge, just under the surface." He pointed out toward the break in the reef, where deep water surged up in pale foam. "When you sail over reefs like this, you don't look for danger, you feel for slope." They stayed there for hours, moving slowly, setting shells and small palm fronds into the water and watching what the sea returned. It wasn't about accuracy. It was about watching without asking the sea to perform. Later, as the tide drew higher, Tavi gestured toward the channel. "See that line?" The boys squinted. A faint dark band appeared beneath the surface, barely visible, running parallel to the reef. "That's the old path," Tavi said. "Used to be how we crossed when the reef cut differently." The boys tried to trace it with their eyes. "Why don't we use it anymore?" one asked. Tavi shrugged. "It sank, or the reef grew, or we forgot, maybe all three." They sat with that idea for a long time. When they returned to the village, the wind had begun to shift. Leaves rustled higher in the trees, and the sea no longer lay smooth in the lagoon. Small ripples crept inward, nudging the tethered canoes with soft insistence. That night, Tavi didn't call them to the canoe house. Instead, he took them to a low sleeping platform built near the edge of the tide. It was just a woven mat frame held on stones, but it faced the water directly. "You'll rest here tonight," he said. "The sea will move beneath your dreams." They lay down without asking why. Hours later, the younger boy woke. The stars above were bright, scattered like sand across a black floor. He could feel the edge of the tide brushing close to the platform stones. It was a sound both sharp and soft, like someone breathing beneath a blanket. He didn't move, he just listened. The tide drew back, then forward again. A rhythm but not mechanical, not even entirely predictable. But something within it made sense. It was like the rocking of the canoe, only without weight. And suddenly, he understood what Tavi had meant. To sleep at sea wasn't about sleep, it was about release. The next morning, they awoke before the birds. The sky was just beginning to pale. Tavi was already waiting near the path. "Come," he said, "we'll go halfway today." They followed. The canoe was already loaded, not with supplies but with teaching tools. Small gourds, pieces of bark, 2 birds in cages, a carved wind vane, a bowl of salt water. They said nothing. They pushed off gently, leaving the shoreline with the same silence as the voyage days ago. Only this time, there was no destination. Tavi steered them into open lagoon water, then curved south, keeping the reef visible but distant. The sail was half raised, enough to catch wind but not to pull strongly. He placed the bowl of salt water near the prow and asked the older boy to watch it. "Tell me when it shifts." They waited. The bowl shimmered, but held flat for a long while. Then, slowly, one edge began to rise. "It's tilting," the boy said. "Which side?" "The left." Tavi adjusted the sail slightly. The canoe corrected, the bowl leveled. "That's how you track shallow lean before you feel it," he said. Next, he released one of the birds. It flew in a low arc, then returned to the canoe without prompting. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It didn't see land," the younger boy said. Tavi nodded. They continued like this for over an hour, releasing, observing, adjusting. Tavi never once mentioned where they were going. That wasn't the point. At last, he asked them to lie flat, backs against the hull, eyes closed. "Tell me when the swell changes." For minutes, they said nothing. Then the older boy lifted a hand slightly. "It dipped more," he said. "Direction? From behind us, lower left." "Good," Tavi said softly. "We just crossed the edge of the reef swell." They didn't open their eyes. By late morning, the canoe turned and drifted toward shore. Not back to the village, but to a small inlet used only by fishers. They landed quietly. Tavi said nothing for a long time. Then finally he turned to them. "You've crossed once. You've remembered twice. Now you'll forget. That's the part no one tells you." They looked confused. "You'll forget the scent," he said. "You'll forget the exact bird flight. You'll forget how the stars looked. All of it." He stood and stepped into the shallows. "But if you keep tying those memory knots, you'll remember how it felt. And that's how you'll find your way again." The sea lapped around their ankles, warm and steady. They didn't speak, and for the first time, they didn't need to. The dawn was slow to break, as if the sky itself was reluctant to leave the darkness behind. The lagoon lay quiet beneath a blanket of soft clouds, its surface barely disturbed except for the occasional ripple left by a passing breeze. The boys sat side by side on the low wooden platform, their legs dangling just above the water. eyes tracing the distant horizon, where sea and sky blended into a muted line. Tavi was already preparing the canoe nearby, moving with deliberate calm that seemed to slow time itself. Today's lesson would be different. The silence between them was filled not with words, but with presence, the kind of attention born from years spent listening to the sea's subtle rhythms. The older boy reached out and touched the water, feeling its coolness seep into his skin, grounding him. The younger one adjusted the woven loops tied around his wrist, a reminder of all the memories they had gathered and those yet to come. Tavi motioned for them to board. The canoe was light, its wooden frame smooth and familiar, but today it felt heavier with expectation. They pushed off gently, the hull gliding over the calm lagoon water, leaving behind only the faintest trace of their passage. The sky remained overcast, a soft gray ceiling that muted the colors around them and seemed to amplify the sound of the paddle dipping rhythmically into the water. As they moved farther from shore, Tavi reached for a small carved stick adorned with feathers and tied with strips of dried leaf. He held it steady against the breeze, watching how it quivered and turned. This was no mere decoration. It was a tool of discernment, a way to read the invisible language of wind and wave. The boys watched intently, their attention sharpened by the gravity of the moment. Tavi spoke softly, explaining how even the gentlest shift in the feather's angle could signal a change in wind direction or strength. He traced invisible lines in the air with the stick, demonstrating how to anticipate the movement of currents just by feeling the breath of the sea. They practiced together, each taking turns holding the stick, learning to sense the wind's secrets. The younger boy hesitated at first, unsure whether he was interpreting the signals correctly. But with Tavi's quiet encouragement, he relaxed, letting his instincts guide him. The feather twirled and settled, a delicate dance that spoke volumes to those who knew how to listen. After a time, Tavi guided them to a spot where the water's color deepened, a subtle shift from turquoise to sapphire. He pointed to the surface, where tiny whirlpools formed briefly before dissolving back into the stillness. These were signs of underwater currents meeting and mixing, invisible forces shaping the sea's surface. He explained how such eddies could either aid or hinder a voyage, depending on their timing and location. The boys leaned over the edge of the canoe, fascinated by the intricate patterns the water traced. Tavi reminded them that navigation was not just about the stars or landmarks. It was also about understanding these fluid movements, the ever-changing conversation between water and wind. Mid-morning passed in quiet observation. The wind began to pick up slightly, causing the canoe to rock gently. Tavi encouraged the boys to feel the difference between the steady swell that carried them and the sudden shifts that warned of changing conditions. He told them how a skilled navigator could predict storms hours before they appeared, simply by reading the sea's subtle cues. As the sun rose higher, a faint scent drifted across the water, a mix of salt, damp earth, and something green and fresh. Tavi inhaled deeply and smiled. "Rain is coming," he said. "The clouds will bring more than water. They bring change." The boys watched as the clouds thickened, rolling in from the east with quiet determination. Tavi adjusted the canoe's course, angling it slightly to take advantage of the shifting wind. The paddle dipped more frequently now, the rhythm faster but still controlled. Then, without warning, a soft patter began, a gentle rain that quickly grew steadier. The droplets created ripples on the lagoon's surface, breaking the smooth mirror into a mosaic of tiny, shimmering circles. The air grew cooler, and the smell of wet foliage intensified. Tavi did not hasten their pace. Instead, he let the rain fall around them, as if it were part of the lesson. He explained how rain could affect navigation, washing away scents, altering wind patterns, and changing the look of the sky. But it also brought clarity, clearing dust, freshening the air, and revealing new signs to those who watched closely. The boys embraced the rain's quiet presence, feeling it soak into their skin and clothes. Their focus shifted inward, learning to trust their senses even when the world around them blurred and changed. As the rain tapered off, the clouds began to break apart, revealing patches of blue and shafts of sunlight that glittered on the wet leaves. The sea shimmered with renewed color, alive with motion and possibility. Tavi pointed toward a cluster of birds resting on a nearby reef, black noddies, their feathers slick with rain. The boys noticed how the birds preened, shook droplets from their wings, and prepared to take flight once more. It was a reminder that life on the sea was not static, but constantly adapting. They continued their journey, the canoe gliding through water still cool and freshly washed. Tavi spoke of patience, of waiting for the right moment to move, of recognizing that sometimes the best course was not the fastest or most direct, but the one that respected the sea's rhythm. The boys absorbed this with growing understanding, realizing that navigation was not merely a skill but a way of living, an ongoing dialogue with nature's subtle signals. By late afternoon, the sun lowered again, casting long shadows across the lagoon. The wind had settled back into its gentle sway. The boys' hands moved confidently now, steady on the paddles, their eyes keen and alert. As the canoe approached the shore, the familiar outlines of Ana appeared through the haze. The reef pass was calm, the water inviting. They slipped quietly into the shallow waters, the journey drawing to a close. Tavi looked at the boys with a quiet pride. "You have listened well," he said. "But remember, the sea's language is endless. Every voyage teaches new words." They stepped onto the sand, their feet sinking softly into the warm grains. The village awaited, unchanged but for their return. That night, as the stars re-emerged in a velvet sky, the boys lay on their mats, the rhythm of the sea still echoing in their minds. The journey was far from over. It had only just begun. The next morning unfolded slowly, wrapped in the soft gray light of dawn. The village was still wrapped in sleep, the air thick with the lingering scent of salt and earth. The boys rose quietly, their bodies already adjusted to the steady cadence of life near the water. Outside, the canoe rested on its supports, polished and waiting. Tavi appeared, carrying a bundle wrapped in woven palm leaves. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. Without speaking, he spread the bundle on the ground and began to unwrap it. Inside were small instruments, carved from bone and wood, some familiar, others strange. "These," Tavi said softly, "are the tools of deeper listening." The boys leaned closer, curious. One instrument resembled a thin, curved tube carved from turtle bone. Another was a flat piece of wood, pierced with small holes and painted with faded red and black patterns. A third was a simple paddle-shaped piece, worn smooth by years of use. "These have been used for generations," Tavi continued. "Not every navigator carries them, but those who listen closely will understand their purpose." He demonstrated first with the curved bone tube, pressing one end gently to his ear and pointing the other toward the water's edge. A faint, almost imperceptible sound emerged, like the whisper of the sea beneath the surface. The boys tried in turn, pressing the tube to their ears. At first, they heard only silence, but as they adjusted the angle, a soft murmur became audible, a language of currents, subtle shifts in tide, and distant waves breaking beyond the reef. Tavi nodded approvingly. "The sea speaks in many voices. This helps you hear what your skin and eyes cannot." Next, he showed the flat wooden piece, explaining it was a wind reader. By holding it up and feeling the flow of air through the holes, a navigator could gauge changes in wind direction and strength, sometimes before the feathers on the sail even moved. The boys practiced with the wind reader, learning to interpret its subtle cues. It was a lesson in patience and stillness, qualities as necessary as strength or speed. Lastly, Tavi held up the paddle-shaped tool. "This is for balance and feeling," he said. "It helps your hands stay steady, your touch sensitive." He handed it to the older boy, who grasped it tentatively, feeling its smooth surface. You will need this when the waves grow tall, when the night is dark, and your senses must be sharper than ever. The morning passed in quiet practice. Tavi guided the boys through exercises, listening to the water's song through the bone tube, interpreting wind shifts, and maintaining steady hands with the paddle tool. The rhythm of their breathing matched the gentle lapping of the lagoon's water. As noon approached, clouds gathered once more, thickening the sky with heavy gray. A breeze stirred the palms, and the air grew cool and damp. Tavi packed the tools carefully and motioned for the boys to follow. They moved toward the canoe, readying it for departure. Today's journey would test more than just their eyes and ears. It would challenge their senses and their trust in the unseen. They pushed off into the lagoon, the water smooth beneath the hull. The canoe moved slowly at first, Tavi steering with practiced ease. The boys held the tools, their hands steady despite the growing anticipation. As they reached deeper waters, the wind picked up. The canoe rocked gently but steadily. Tavi instructed the boys to use their tools, listening and feeling for changes. The bone tube carried whispers of distant currents. The wind reader danced with the breeze. The paddle tool steadied hands against the rising swell. The rain began again, a soft patter at first, then a steady fall that blurred the horizon. Visibility dropped, and the stars and sun disappeared behind thick clouds. Tavi spoke softly, reminding them that in such moments trust was vital. Not just trust in tools or skills, but in oneself and the sea's subtle language. The boys learned to rely on touch and intuition when sight failed. Hours passed in the gray, the rain's rhythm marking time. Suddenly, through the veil of droplets, a distant shape appeared, the faint outline of a reef, barely visible. Tavi smiled. You have found the reef by feeling the sea, not by seeing. The boys exchanged glances, an unspoken acknowledgement that this was more than a lesson. It was a rite of passage. They followed the contour of the reef, noting changes in water color and the shifting patterns of wave breaks. Tavi guided them carefully through the channel, pointing out subtle cues. The way foam gathered in certain patches, the occasional flutter of seabirds, the scent of salt and coral. At last they entered a calm lagoon, the water sheltered by surrounding islets. The rain stopped abruptly and the sun broke through the clouds, casting warm light over the water. Tavi guided the canoe to a small beach where palm trees bent gracefully toward the shore. They stepped out, feet sinking into warm sand. Tavi looked at the boys with quiet pride. You have listened deeply, he said. Now you must remember that listening never ends. That evening, around the fire, stories were shared. Tales of voyages long past, of storms weathered and islands found by the faintest signs. The boys sat wrapped in blankets, the fire's glow soft against the dark sky. Their minds were full but calm, their bodies tired but content. They understood now that navigation was not just about reaching a destination, but about living in harmony with the sea's endless voice. As they prepared to sleep, the older boy whispered to the younger, "Do you think we will ever forget these lessons?" The younger smiled softly, "Only if we stop listening." And in the quiet night, under the endless stars, they drifted to sleep, carried gently by the rhythm of the waves. The early morning light filtered softly through the palms, casting long shadows across the sandy paths of the village. The boys awoke with a quiet urgency, a feeling that today held something different, something weightier than the routine lessons they had come to expect. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant salt of the ocean, both mingling to create a perfume that was as familiar as the rhythm of the waves themselves. Tavi was waiting near the canoe, his face calm but alert. He carried a small bundle wrapped in bark cloth, worn smooth by years of handling. Without a word, he beckoned the boys to follow. Their footsteps fell softly on the warm sand as they walked toward the reef's edge, where the water gleamed like molten glass in the early light. This was no ordinary day. Tavi's expression held the quiet seriousness of a man about to reveal a deeper truth. A truth hidden not in maps or stars, but in the subtle language of the sea itself. He stopped at a shallow pool formed by the tide, its surface perfectly still. He knelt beside it and untied the bark cloth, revealing a collection of small shells, each one different. Some striped, some spotted, others smooth and pearly. The boys leaned in, intrigued by the delicate beauty of the shells. "These are more than just shells," Tavi began. "They are markers, signs left by the sea and by those who came before us." He picked up a striped shell and traced its edge with a careful finger. Each shell has a place, each pattern a meaning. The boys exchanged glances, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Tavi arranged the shells along the edge of the pool in a pattern that seemed random to an untrained eye, but held a rhythm all its own. He explained that these markers were used to remember places, safe passages, hidden reefs, and islands that appeared like mirages on the horizon. The sea, he said, was not a flat map, but a living memory, changing with tides and seasons. The shells were a way to hold on to that memory. After laying out the shells, Tavi asked the boys to close their eyes and listen, not to the obvious sounds of waves or birds, but to the quieter ones. The whisper of water moving beneath the coral, the faint rustle of leaves stirred by an unseen breeze, the distant call of a seabird signaling a change in wind. They sat in silence, eyes closed, letting these soft sounds fill the space around them. It was a meditation of sorts, a way to attune their senses to the subtle messages the environment sent. When they opened their eyes, the shells were still arranged on the wet sand, glistening like small jewels. Tavi began to tell them about the importance of memory in navigation, not just memory of places, but memory of sensations, smells, and sounds. He spoke of how Polynesian sailors had for centuries relied on these markers and their intimate knowledge of the sea's moods to cross vast distances without instruments. The boys listened intently, absorbing each word with a growing sense of wonder. Later, they moved to the canoe, preparing it for a new kind of journey. This time, Tavi explained, they would not follow the stars or the wind alone. They would learn to navigate by rain. Rain was more than a weather event. It was a signal, a map drawn across sky and sea. Different rains smelled different, some sweet, some sharp, some earthy, and each type told of shifting winds, changing currents, and distant lands. As they pushed off from shore, the air was heavy with moisture, and clouds gathered overhead like a silent army preparing to march across the sky. The canoe glided through the water, the rhythm of the paddle strokes matching the steady beat of the approaching storm. Tavi pointed to the horizon where the first drops began to fall, soft at first, then growing heavier. "The smell of rain guides us," he said. "Listen with your nose, with your skin. The sea speaks through the clouds." The boys breathed deeply, the scent of wet earth and salt filling their lungs. It was a language they had never been taught in words but had always known. As the rain fell, the world transformed. Colors deepened, sounds softened, and the air grew thick with life. Tavi guided the canoe beneath the shelter of a leaning palm, using the storm's patterns to judge direction and distance. The boys felt the power of the rain, its ability to erase and reveal, to confuse and clarify. They learned that rain could wash away familiar scents, making the sea seem new and unfamiliar. But it could also bring new signs, smells carried from distant islands, changes in temperature that hinted at shifting currents, and the altered flight patterns of birds. The journey continued under the heavy sky, the boys' senses alive to every change. By afternoon, the rain had eased, leaving behind a sky streaked with silver clouds and a lagoon shimmering with reflected light. Tavi brought the canoe ashore on a small island they had not visited before, its beach rimmed with shells and driftwood. Here, he told them, was the place where many navigators came to rest, to renew their memory of the sea and sky before continuing onward. The boys explored the island quietly, collecting shells and stones, tying more loops of braided leaf to their wrists, each knot a promise to remember. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long golden rays over the water, Tavi gathered them once more. "Every journey is a story," he said. "Every drop of rain, every scent on the wind, every shell on the shore, they are chapters in that story." The boys looked out over the water, feeling the vastness of the ocean and the weight of history carried within its waves. They understood that navigation was more than skill. It was a way of being, a way of living in harmony with a world that was constantly changing, yet always familiar. As night fell and stars blinked into existence overhead, the boys lay beneath the open sky, the gentle sound of waves lulling them toward sleep. The sea's language was endless, and they were only beginning to learn its many voices. The morning arrived with a delicate hush, as if the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation. The village was quiet, the only sounds those of the early birds and the gentle rustling of palm fronds stirred by a faint breeze. The boys woke slowly, their bodies still heavy with the memory of the previous day's lessons, yet eager for what lay ahead. Outside, the lagoon shimmered softly, the water reflecting the pale light like glass. Tavi was already waiting by the canoe, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. He greeted the boys with a nod, but said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the first hints of cloud drifted across the sky like whispers. Without delay, he began preparing the canoe, carefully inspecting every joint and lash, ensuring that it was ready for the journey. Today's lesson was one of patience and observation, a subtle art that required the sailor to become one with the environment, to feel the pulse of the ocean beneath the waves and the breath of the wind in the air. The boys boarded the canoe quietly, settling into their places as Tavi pushed off from shore with practiced ease. As the canoe slipped through the water, the world seemed to shrink, the village disappearing behind them until only the vast expanse of sea and sky remained. The air was still, the water calm, and the only sounds were the soft splash of the paddle and the faint cries of distant seabirds. The boys' attention sharpened, every sense alert yet calm, waiting for the subtle cues that would guide their path. Tavi reached into a small pouch and pulled out a handful of fragrant leaves, crushed between his fingers to release their scent. He handed them to the boys, explaining that these were not mere herbs but tools to attune the navigator's senses to the rhythms of the environment. The boys inhaled deeply, the sharp, earthy aroma mingling with the salty air, grounding them in the moment. The canoe glided onward, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. Tavi pointed toward a distant cloud bank, its edges tinged with silver light. "The shape and movement of clouds are like words in a language," he said softly. "They tell us where the winds will blow, where the rains will fall, and how the sea will change." The boys studied the clouds, noting the way some seemed to gather and swell, while others stretched thin and dissipated. Tavi explained how different cloud formations signaled various weather patterns, and how ancient navigators had learned to read these signs with great precision. Suddenly, a shadow passed over the water, a flock of white terns dipping and weaving in a complex dance. Tavi smiled and nodded toward them. "Birds are guides as well," he said. "Their flight tells us where the land lies, where fish gather, and even how the wind shifts." The boys watched the terns with renewed focus, following their movements and trying to interpret their silent messages. They learned to notice the bird's direction, height, and speed, understanding that even the smallest change could signal a vital piece of information. As the day progressed, the wind began to pick up, stirring the waves into gentle swells that rocked the canoe. Tavi encouraged the boys to feel the water's movement through the hull, to sense its direction and strength, and to adjust their paddling accordingly. The lesson was not just about skill, but about becoming part of the sea's living rhythm. Mid-afternoon brought a change in light and temperature. The sun dipped behind a veil of clouds, and the air grew cooler and heavier with moisture. Tavi pointed to the distant horizon, where darkening skies hinted at an approaching storm. He instructed the boys to prepare the canoe, adjusting the sail and checking the lashings. "The sea can change quickly," he reminded them. "A good navigator is always ready." The first drops of rain began to fall, light and scattered at first, then growing steadier. The boys felt the cool patter on their skin and heard the soft hiss of rain hitting the water. The world transformed into a muted palette of grays and blues, the sea and sky blending into one. Tavi urged them to focus on the rain's sound and scent, explaining how different rains carried distinct messages. Some were warm and heavy, signaling a change in the wind. Others were light and cool, hinting at distant weather systems. The canoe moved steadily through the rain, the boys learning to trust their senses even as visibility diminished. They adjusted their course using subtle shifts in wind and water, guided by the knowledge that no instrument could replace. Hours passed in the rain's embrace, the steady rhythm of droplets marking time like a metronome. The boys grew quiet, their minds attuned to the sea's whispered secrets. As the storm began to wane, Tavi pointed toward a distant island, its silhouette emerging through the mist like a ghost from another time. "There is our destination," he said simply. The canoe moved toward the shore, navigating carefully through shallow reefs and hidden channels. The boys noted the change in water color, the rise and fall of waves, and the flight of seabirds returning to roost. They landed softly on a sandy beach rimmed with coral and shells. The island felt ancient, untouched by time, a place where the sea's stories had been preserved. Tavi led the boys inland, through dense foliage and shaded paths, to a clearing where a fire burned low. Here, other navigators waited, men and women with weathered faces and eyes full of stories. The boys sat among them, listening as the elders spoke of voyages past and future, of storms survived and lands discovered. The tales were not grand or heroic, but filled with the quiet persistence of those who live in harmony with the sea. As night fell, the boys lay beneath the open sky, the constellations bright and steady overhead. They felt the weight of history and the endless possibility of the ocean. The lessons of the day settled in their minds, the importance of patience, observation, and trust. And as they drifted to sleep, the rhythm of the waves carried them gently into dreams. In a small clearing, they found an elder waiting, a man with weathered skin and eyes that held the wisdom of countless voyages. He greeted them silently, his presence commanding respect without words. The elder led them to a sheltered spot where they could rest and share stories. As the boys listened, they learned of the deep connection between navigator and environment, the respect for every leaf, every breeze, every wave that made the voyage possible. Night fell slowly, the sky studded with stars that seemed closer and brighter than ever before. The boys lay on woven mats beneath the open sky, their bodies tired, but their minds alight with new understanding. They realized that navigation was not just a skill, but a lifelong practice, a way of living in harmony with the sea's endless rhythms and whispers. As sleep claimed them, the gentle sound of waves carried their dreams, weaving tales of distant islands, shifting winds, and the timeless dance between sailor and sea. The dawn arrived gently, a soft blush spreading slowly across the horizon. The boys awoke to the quiet sounds of the island, the distant cry of seabirds, the rustling of palm leaves stirred by a faint breeze, and the rhythmic lapping of the ocean against the shore. The world felt expansive and serene, as though it were holding its breath in anticipation of the lessons to come. Tavi was already preparing the morning meal, his hands moving with practiced ease as he roasted freshly gathered breadfruit over the glowing embers. His eyes reflected the calm certainty of a man deeply connected to the sea, a man who had spent countless days and nights learning to listen to its countless voices. Today's lesson would challenge the boys in new ways, pushing them to deepen their understanding of the subtle signals that guided their ancestors across vast and unpredictable waters. It was a lesson in resilience, intuition, and the intricate dance between human skill and natural forces. After breakfast, Tavi led the boys to the edge of the island, where the shore met the open sea. The tide was low, revealing patches of coral and scattered shells glinting in the morning light. The canoe rested on the sand, ready to carry them once more into the wide blue beyond. As they boarded, Tavi spoke softly, reminding them that every journey was a conversation with the sea, a dialogue that required patience, respect, and attention to detail. The canoe slipped smoothly into the water, the paddle strokes steady and measured. The boys settled into the rhythm, their eyes scanning the horizon and their senses alert to every whisper of wind and water. As they moved farther from land, the sea deepened in color, shifting from turquoise to an endless, velvety blue. The sky stretched wide above them, a vast canvas painted with the soft hues of morning. Tavi instructed the boys to focus on the subtle patterns of the waves, the way they rose and fell, their direction and speed. He explained how the sea's surface could reveal hidden currents and obstacles, invisible to the eye, but essential for safe passage. The boys practiced reading these signs, their hands steady on the paddles as they adjusted their course in response to the changing water. The lesson was one of harmony, finding balance between human intention and the sea's natural flow. Mid-morning brought a change in the atmosphere. Clouds gathered slowly, their shapes shifting like smoke on the horizon. Tavi pointed to a particular formation, a flat, dark cloud that stretched low over the water. "That is a sign," he said. "It tells us to prepare." The wind began to stir, a soft whisper growing into a steady breeze. The boys felt the change in the air, the subtle drop in temperature, and the increasing movement of the waves. Tavi instructed them to adjust the sail and prepare the canoe for what was to come. He emphasized the importance of readiness, not just for storms, but for any sudden change in the environment. As the wind strengthened, the sea responded with rolling swells that rocked the canoe gently at first, then with growing intensity. The boys worked together, their movements practiced and precise, managing the sail and paddles in harmony. Raindrops began to fall, light and scattered, soon growing into a steady shower. The world around them softened into a muted palette of grays and blues, the rain blurring the horizon and muffling sounds. Tavi spoke calmly about the rain's role, not only as a challenge, but as a guide. He described how different rains carried different messages, how their scent and sound could indicate changes in wind direction, pressure, and even nearby land. The boys listened closely, breathing in the cool, fresh air and tuning their senses to the subtle shifts. They learned to navigate not just by sight, but by feeling the rain on their skin and the wind's caress. The storm built slowly, waves rising and crashing with increasing power. The canoe pitched and rolled, demanding every ounce of
skill and concentration. The boys worked together seamlessly, guided by Tavi's steady voice and the lessons etched into their memory. Hours passed in this delicate balance between human effort and natural force. The rain slowed, then ceased, leaving behind a sky streaked with fading clouds and a sea sparkling with fresh light. As the storm cleared, a new challenge appeared, a dense fog rolling in from the open ocean, swallowing the horizon and muting the world into a gray veil. Tavi explained that fog was a test of trust. Without sight, the navigator must rely entirely on memory, intuition, and the subtle signs of wind, water, and sound. The boys felt a quiet tension as the canoe moved into the fog, the world shrinking to the immediate space around them. They listened to the water, the distant calls of seabirds, and the feel of the wind. Tavy guided them steadily, reminding them that fear could cloud judgment, but calm observation would reveal the way. Minutes stretched into hours as they navigated through the thick mist, the boys' senses heightened to every nuance. The rain and fog had stripped away all distractions, leaving only the pure connection between navigator and sea. Gradually, the fog lifted, revealing the familiar outlines of a distant island. The boys breathed a collective sigh of relief, their hearts steady, but full of quiet pride. They made landfall, stepping onto warm sand and feeling the solid earth beneath their feet. The island was quiet and still, a sanctuary after the ocean's wild embrace. Around a campfire, the navigators gathered, sharing stories of voyages past. As night fell, the boys lay beneath the vast star-filled sky. The constellations shone brightly, their familiar patterns a comforting presence. They reflected on the day's journey, the storm, the fog, the lessons of resilience and trust. In the quiet darkness, they understood that navigation was not just a skill, but a way of life, one that demanded patience, humility, and an unwavering connection to the natural world. As sleep embraced them, the rhythm of the waves lulled them into dreams, filled with endless horizons and the gentle whisper of the sea. The dawn broke softly over the horizon, casting a pale golden light that shimmered across the gentle waves. The boys awoke slowly, the calm of the early morning wrapping around them like a soft blanket. The island was quiet, save for the occasional call of distant seabirds and the whisper of a breeze weaving through the palms. They rose with a quiet purpose, knowing that today marked the culmination of everything they had learned. The final step in a journey that had stretched beyond physical miles, into the depths of understanding and respect for the sea. Tavy moved among them with quiet assurance, his movements steady and deliberate. His eyes reflected the deep knowledge that came from a lifetime spent listening, not just with ears, but with every sense tuned to the subtle language of wind, water, and sky. Without words, he prepared the canoe, checking every lash and seam with care, as if preparing an old friend for a long voyage. As the boys gathered by the shore, Tavi spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and hope. Today, you take what you have learned. The stories of the clouds, the songs of the rain, the dance of the birds, and the whispers of the waves, and you bring them together. Navigation is not just about direction. It is about harmony, balance, and connection. The boys nodded, their faces a mixture of reverence and quiet excitement. They stepped into the canoe, their hands steady on the paddles, their hearts aligned with the rhythm of the sea. Pushing off into the calm waters, the canoe glided smoothly beyond the island's protective reef. The open ocean stretched before them, an endless canvas of blue and sky. The wind was gentle but purposeful, filling the sail with a steady breath that carried them forward. Davy guided the boys in reading the environment, reminding them that every element, the color of the sky, the texture of the water, the pattern of the clouds, was part of a vast conversation. They learned to read the clouds, not only as signs of weather, but as markers of unseen currents. The rain, with its varied scent and sound, told stories of distant lands and shifting winds. The flight of birds guided their direction, while the sea itself murmured beneath them, alive with hidden currents and moods. Hours passed as the canoe moved steadily through the water. The boys practiced all they had been taught, adjusting their course with gentle corrections, feeling the pulse of the ocean through the hull and trusting the subtle signals around them. They were not just sailors, but participants in a living tradition that honored the sea's many voices.
As the sun climbed high, clouds gathered once more, soft gray shapes edged with silver light. Tavi explained the significance of each formation, teaching the boys to anticipate changes and to prepare accordingly. When rain began to fall, light at first and then steadily, the boys felt the transformation of the world around them. The way colors softened, sounds became muffled, and the air grew thick with moisture and possibility. The rain was not an obstacle, but a guide, reshaping the landscape and revealing new signs. The boys learned to read the scent carried on the wind, to feel the shifts in temperature and pressure, and to trust these cues as they adjusted their course. As afternoon waned into evening, the rain ceased, leaving behind a fresh, vibrant world. The clouds parted to reveal a sky painted with warm hues of orange and pink. The sea mirrored this display, a glassy surface reflecting the fading light. Tavi guided the canoe toward a distant island, its silhouette dark against the glowing horizon. The boys felt a deep connection as they approached the shore, a sense of completion and renewal mingling with the anticipation of arrival. Landing softly on the beach, they stepped onto warm sand and looked out over the calm waters. The island was a sanctuary, a place where stories could be shared and remembered, where the sea's lessons could be passed to the next generation. Around a fire, the navigators gathered, elders and young alike, sharing tales of voyages, storms weathered, and islands found by the faintest of signs. The boys listened, their hearts full, their minds open to the wisdom carried through countless journeys. Night fell, and the sky stretched overhead in a vast expanse of stars. The constellations shone like ancient guides, their steady presence a reminder of the continuity of tradition and the unending quest for understanding. Lying beneath the stars, the boys reflected on their journey. The storms faced, the rains smelled, the birds followed, and the seas read. They understood that navigation was not merely a skill, but a profound way of knowing, a deep relationship with the natural world built on respect, patience, and attentiveness. They knew that the lessons would continue, carried forward not just in knowledge, but in the rhythms of daily life. The quiet listening to rain, the careful watching of clouds, and the steady feeling of the sea beneath their feet. As sleep embraced them, the gentle sound of waves whispered a lullaby, carrying them into dreams filled with endless horizons and the soft voices of the ocean. In the stillness of the night, one thought lingered. How many journeys have been shaped not by sight or instruments, but by the invisible, intangible language of the world around us, spoken in smells, sounds, and subtle signs that require patience to learn and humility to trust. And so, the story of navigation by the smell of rain and the countless quiet lessons of the sea continues, woven into the lives of those who listen. Story transition. The canoe fades into the pale light of morning, its whispers now part of the sea's memory, unspoken but not forgotten. But the ocean holds more than motion. It remembers voices, It remembers faces that once looked to the stars, not for wonder, but for survival. As one journey ends in silence, another begins in story. Now let us drift toward the elders, keepers of ancient skies, guardians of constellations carved not in books, but in sea foam and memory.